this week, I want to talk about myth and the role of myth as a key agent of sacred space and actually a portal into sacred space, and talk about how myth is actually a portal into sacred space. That's why it's kind of special in its own way. Now, to enter myth is to enter sacred space. Every myth is a kind of temple you enter into and are transformed from the experience if you are able to access its powers. If you go into a myth and you read it in a profane way, and there's nothing wrong with that, you can, and we'll give you examples today. If you enter into a myth and you read it in a profane way, you will come away with profane nourishment and takeaways. If you go into a myth and you read it in a sacred way, in a mythopoetic way, which is how we've been doing everything in these sessions, you will receive a different kind of nourishment, a different kind of emotional nourishment and spiritual nourishment, which is also very powerful. This is why for fairy tales and myth, there's always an initiatory kind of crossing of the threshold. So for fairy tales, typically it's once upon a time, once upon a time, right? Once you hear that phrase, once upon a time, it is very specifically a signal that you are leaving historical chronological time and you are entering into the eternal, into sacred time. Even modern movies, at the beginning of every Star Wars movie, right, Lucas was very specific that you're entering into a mythic realm where everything's different, you know, like the old jokes of how come, you know, laser beams go choo 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 in space. Space is a vacuum, there is no sound. That doesn't matter. You're entering into a dream world, and the signal that you're entering into that at the beginning of every Star Wars movie is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which is the equivalent of once upon a time, right? So it's very deliberate, very deliberate. So what is a myth? One of my favorite definitions of a myth is that it's something that never happened in historical time, something that never happened, but is true, but is true. And what this means to me is that a myth plays out an archetypal pattern of action, right? Not a static symbol, not just the whale, right? Not just the frog and the ball or the sleeping princess, right? Not a static symbol, but the whole story is the symbol, is the archetype. And it is a reflection of the deeper, some aspect. Every fairy tale is a reflection of the deeper physics within us, right? So did Theseus ever enter the labyrinth, a physical, historical Theseus ever enter the labyrinth and slay an actual minotaur? Historically, probably not. But the action of it is true. Ariadne and the golden thread leading him through the labyrinth, right? The whole backstory of how the minotaur even came to be and came to be trapped in the labyrinth built by Daedalus, right? All of that action is true, right? Seen with a mythopoetic lens, it tells you something about how you work inside, how every human being works inside. And it will give you a kind of treasure map, an instruction map as to what to do when you face certain situations, right? So the beauty of archetype is not just that it's a single static symbol that's like subject to all this intellectualizing and interpretation, but the overall pattern of action, right? Jonah and the whale, for instance. The whale is a symbol of this and that, and we can talk all day about it. But when you press play on the myth of Jonah and the whale comes up, swallows Jonah, goes down for 3 days. There are certain physics in the action of the symbol, in the interaction between Jonah and the whale and God, that give you this revealed truth. And you can read it in a profane way where it's like, well, then you should follow the word of God no matter what, or the whale will come and punish you. Or you can read it in a sacred way, right? There are powers deep within us that are bigger than us. And when there is a path that we will go on, even if we resist in the profane, the powers will come up and bring us forward on the path anyway. And your choice is to go kicking and screaming or to go willingly. Right? That's perhaps one of the mythopoetic takeaways of a story like Jonah and the Whale. So there is a single archetype, and an overall story pattern as archetype. This is the power of myth. Any of these patterns in these stories, like so the whale swallowing Jonah, an evil stepmother bullying the stepson or stepdaughter, right? Monster chasing a person, or a frog, right? In the Frog King example that I posted a few sessions back. A scary exiled element within you, wrongly cheated, and returning after a while, making his claim, right? Resisted, and afterwards, when you finally give in to him, being discovered that he was Prince Charming within you. He was the key to everything. He was the key to opening up all these blockages and releasing you from your curse, releasing him from his curse, and entering both of you into blessing, right? And one of the most powerful things about myth is that when you enter into a myth in a sacred way, when you come out, you are transformed in the sense that it kind of like realigns you, right? You feel better because like everything's been like reordered. Everything's been like snapped back into the original template of your own inner DNA, mythopoetic DNA. And you come out and you're like, you know, oftentimes when I tell these stories, like the story of Philoctetes in the money session, or the Frog King, or the Fisher King, right? Or Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, any of these stories that I've told in the past sessions and in the programs that I give, et cetera, people will say, you know, I came out of that story and I heard your interpretation. I did get insight, but just this overall feeling of like, I just feel better. I feel relieved and I don't even know why, right? And that is the power of myth. It's hard to pin down in linear, profane, controllable terms. It's like getting an adjustment at the chiropractors or coming back from a good yoga class after being away from a long time. Or even getting your haircut or nails done after a long time in quarantine, right? When the nail salons finally open, you feel reordered and reset to the proper form again somehow. But the resetting is somehow with a myth internal. So the main example I'll give, I won't tell any stories today, but I'll just give you links to them, is still the Frog King, Grimm Brothers #1, the first story of the Grimm Brothers collection is the Frog King, popularly known as the Princess and the Frog, right? The princess loses her ball down the well, the frog gets it back for her, they make a deal, she reneges on the deal, and he comes in and presses his case. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't listened to it yet, definitely give it a listen. If you're interested in experiencing a myth in this fashion, where it serves to realign and reorder you into the feeling of the sacred just from hearing the story told. Now, I've got to tell you, for me, every time I rehear or reread the Frog King story or any other myth or fairy tale, even me, I've heard the Frog King like millions of times. I've told it millions of times at this point. I always get something new out of it, or another dot gets connected in the constellation of my understanding of my own inner self into the larger pattern of my life. And truly great fairy tales are like this inexhaustible wellspring of reflection and insight and rejuvenation. Every time you are realigned, right, by, say, a myth, it's because you were unaligned before that, right? You got out of alignment, and then the myth kind of reorders you, brings you back in alignment. Fabulous. But the thing is, the realignment place you come back into always seems to be about the same, where you come back into, say, reconciliation with another inner frog that you've discovered, okay? But the added interesting thing is that whenever we get unaligned, we always get unaligned in a kind of unique, different way, depending on like the forces of the world that are acting on us at any given time, and also at that age and stage in my life. When I would get unaligned as a 17-year-old, right, it's very different from when I get unaligned as right now a 48-year-old. It's very different. Sometimes it's not completely different, unfortunately, but often it is very different. And the point there is that when you come back into alignment from different places of disalignment, and you hear like the Frog King myth and you come back into alignment, the travel path from different places back to that one place reveals something to you, right? It reveals something to you. So when like if you're a physician and you're trying to get someone back to a certain standard of health, if they come in and they had this ailment versus that ailment versus a different ailment. When you watch them take the path back to health from different kinds of ailment, you learn something about the nature of being human from a medical standpoint. And for me, I sometimes feel like that's why I have such a blessing in my own bliss. I feel like I'm learning so much every day as a healer, because the privilege of what I get to do and the blessing that I feel so grateful for every day when I wake up is that I get to feel and hear about so many, 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 many of you all at a time, every day, coming back into alignment by your own reports and updates back to me, right? Typically by email or live group advising or even here. And every time I hear about one of your updates, I feel totally blessed. And I learn something new, and it feeds my own inner library of like patterns, like my own inner medical library of patterns, so that I have a bit more capability to advise the next person who comes to me on what might be going on to maybe help them. Okay. So, and myth is a huge part of this. I don't use myth in the programs kind of upfront, because myths themselves are kind of exiles of our world, right? They come back in Hollywood and storytelling, kind of, but myths in a purely sacred form are very rare, right? It's almost like in our profane society, we are so starved for the sacred aspect of myth in our lives that even through the profane machine of Hollywood, we will glom onto them. We call them franchises, right? So if you get really into the Harry Potter franchise or the Star Wars franchise or the Marvel Avengers franchise, these are not bad things, right? But the thing is, they can only go so deep in terms of the depth of the reconciliation and the physics of it, because they have to stay close enough to the profane that the movies actually sell. And if they don't sell, then if you go too sacred, it's not going to sell, and you never get that full juice out of watching, the Marvel Avengers series. But the physics are very similar. You feel like, okay, I'm kind of getting tired of the Marvel series, but the 11th movie has come out. How am I not going to watch that? It's like going to church, right? It's like, how am I not going to watch that? And the profane engine banks on that. And it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the thing is, a series like this, like The Sacred Space, it will always, I can't charge for this, right? This is like Sacred Space. We're kind of following our noses in terms of what people need in terms of the sacred. But for us, even here, to kind of gradually go back to center, we find ourselves being led back to the world of myth and story and fairy tale as well. Because there's certain things that you just can't express linearly, intellectually, in any other way other than telling a story. So we're going to go back in that direction, right? We're going back in that direction. So next I want to say just a little bit about how to read a myth. Now there's a whole session, actually a live Sacred Space session on dreams that we gave. I think it was like the second or third session of this series. Also 7-Day Healing Day 2 in the supplemental, not the auditor. I talk all about dreams because you can ask about the dreams in live group advising. So how you read a myth is very similar to how you read dreams, where the story events, as well as symbols and characters, where you regard every character and symbol not as the outer version of it, but as a different part of our own inner self. Male characters, masculine characters, animals, objects, people, will tend to depict your own inner masculine in various aspects. Female feminine characters will tend to depict your own inner feminine in various aspects. Anything scary chasing you can be depicted as an exile, a lost board member trying to get back to you, get to a message. I won't sort of rehash all of that. You can watch those sessions. And then some common motifs and their common meanings are typically shared across streams and more universal myths, right? When a whale comes to you in a dream, it's not that different from when the whale came to Jonah in the Bible story. Now, beyond your own dreams, though, reading your own dreams, there are certain distinct advantages to also reading the more universal, unauthored myth and fairy tale. unauthored means you don't know who wrote it. Like who wrote the story of Psyche and Eros? Nobody knows. Right? I mean, even Philoctetes, it's like there's a play by Sophocles. I think Aeschylus has a play on Philoctetes as well. But the myth of Sophocles itself is unauthored. Right? Its origins are lost in the myth in the mists of time. So from the Grimm brothers, from Greek tradition, from Hindu tradition, from Celtic tradition, like the entire Grail cycle, Arthurian cycle, is from the Celtic tradition, Native American tradition, African Aboriginal tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, the reason why ancient myths with no author that has been retold many times over like millennia, the reason these myths work better than those which have specific authors and which have been created in recent history, like you could say Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, right, are good fairy tales, but they're written by one author. The Star Wars, the Marvel Avengers, they're written by screenwriters that are working in the contemporary time. The same mythic patterns are coming out of them, right? So it's perfectly valid, but they're brand new. They're brand new, right? So there are pluses and minuses to that. The pluses are that they can seem more relevant. The special effects are cooler, right? But the minuses are that myths that have been distilled through different epochs of human history, through collective human experiences, and actually survived Inquisition, survived book burning, survived the sacking of cities from one empire to the next, that have survived centuries. It's like they have been purified down to the essence of the archetypal pattern. Right, like Grimm brothers' tales, for instance, are folk tales. They were collected from the folk, the people of northern Germany. Through the oral tradition, these are the old wives' tales and fairy tales that were told in that culture. So they're passed down through oral tradition within families and clans. And some scholars date these story fragments to be as old as 10 to 20,000 years old. They were very, very old. And when you experience a fully intact fragment, like the Frog King, and you actually read it well through a skillful mythopoetic lens, it can have an absolutely powerful effect. Now, more recent authored fairy tales have more bias. They're more sort of tossed around by the needs of, like a J.K. Rowling to write her own experience and to be commercially viable. There's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, you take the Harry Potter series, fast forward it through 10,000 years, and you will have a myth just as potent as the Frog King or any other. But because they're more recent, because they're authored, they're a bit more like personal dreams, if you will. So Hans Christian Andersen tales are very good, but when you read them, because they're from him and they're only like 100 years old, you're also getting a healthy dose of his own like mother issues and wounds and everything. It's like very obvious when you read his stories, right? And in 10,000 years, though, if his stories survive, they will be distilled down just like a river stone becomes smooth after 10,000 years in the water, right? So that's just the physics of it. There's no right or wrong, better or worse. But the thing is, if you want an older story like that, you don't have to wait 10,000 years. You can just pick an older, unauthored story. You can just go to the Greek myths. You can go to the fairy tales. That's the beauty of our human tradition. It's the wealth of our culture, really. Now, some other differences between fairy tale and dreams is that dreams will tend, not always, but tend to use characters we know in personal life. So my boss who's giving me a hard time at work, a love interest that I don't know what to do with, right? My kids. Characters of fairy tales, however, are unfamiliar and alien the first time you read them anyway. After you read them many times, I mean, the Frog and the Frog King is like an old friend at this point, right? The advantage in fairy tales, therefore, is that when you're receiving the message, there's lower risk of us mixing them up with our personal relationships in the outer world, like we tend to do with our dreams. So in other words, if I dream of, a woman that I'm dating or seeing or whatever, I can very easily go in the profane direction and say, well, this means that I should stop dating or I should keep dating her. Or I could go through the mythopoetic lens and say, no, this is a reflection of my own inner feminine. And when she says this, it's my own inner feminine saying this to me. And how do I feel about that, right? So when it's a fairy tale, It's not someone you know in real life. And so the message is coming from collective human experience, reflected through these parts of you as avatars. And so the message for you at an individual can feel a bit more abstract at first, but also because of this reason, the wisdom from fairy tales can be vast and deep, where they speak to a part of you that is common to every human that's ever walked the earth. And even despite that, it feels just as powerful for you as if your own grandmother gave you this advice just for you specifically, knowing you like the back of her hand. Right? That's the power of a myth and fairy tale. But the key is to read a fairy tale from a mythopoetic view, a sacred view, not a pedantic view, not a profane view. So from the sacred view, not from the profane view. And I'll just give you a quick example with the Frog King, right? The Princess and the Frog. So when people listen to the Frog King, right, a familiar children's tale for most people, mostly it is read from a profane everyday view, right? Selectively applied to the regular outer world, right? So mothers for generations will read the Frog King to their daughters and say, so you see, honey, to find your Prince Charming in life, you're going to have to kiss a lot of frogs, right? And, that's fine, right? That's fine. You can say that. It is useful at that profane level also. But in reality, you're doing a very selective reading of that, because in the actual Frog King story, there's not multiple frogs. There's only one frog, right? And you, the princess, actually cheat the frog first, right? And then it comes back. And so you get the idea. So from the perspective of healing, when I do even a cursory reading of a Frog King at a public talk or whatever, right, where I say the frog is you and the princess is you and the golden ball is you, and then I hit play, and you can read this and experience this directly with the link I've given you. So not to nag you, but if you want to know it, you can check it out. I won't sort of redo it here. When you hit play and explain the action as it unfolds between the princess and the frog and the golden ball, I've often had the experience in person or even online where people listening to me in person will just burst into tears because the message is so universal and so powerful. And so they have been dramatically realigned by it, transformed by it. It is a huge metanoia, as we've been saying, right? A huge turning around of mind and heart. So you see the entire world, you see yourself in a completely different way. It is a relief and liberation, and the newness of the vision, the stark newness of the vision, right, makes you charged up and ready to have another go at life from a different angle. You have, in other words, taken a deep drink from the well springs of life and myth, and it is just amazing. So I've linked to the Frog King on the resource page that I've given for this session. And on that same page, there's a second link, which is another good example of what I'm talking about, which we shared recently, which was the story of Philoctetes, which I told in the May 17th Sacred Space session on like money and economic crisis and the sacred aspect of money. So a bunch of you saw that already. But Gowrie actually, following her own muse very interestingly, has made a clip of just the Philoctetes story, about 10 minutes. And that's what's linked to in the resource page. So if you want to rehear a 10-minute version of Philoctetes, you can do that. And so this is a more general point. Anything, any myth, let's just go there, any religion for that matter, can be profaned if you use it in a profane way. Or it can be used in a sacred, healing way, right? And I got a couple emails on this just to sort of talk about this interesting case. The story of Savitri we talked about last week that Gowrie so beautifully gave us, right? It is deeply powerful as a sacred reading, but in regular modern Hindu society, it is used all the time in a profane way, right? They read that story and they say to girls, oh, see, wives need to be loyal to their husbands, even face down the god of death if you have to, and be loyal without question, right? But that, first of all, that's a profane view. It's fear, threat, and control. But also, when you think about that view, that selective patriarchal reading makes no mention of the fact that of all these other extraordinary details of the same story. For instance, the husband must be chosen by the wife. Ha ha ha, right? The wife gets to choose the husband. It's not arranged by the family. That detail got left out with the classic, right, profane reading. And also, the fact that the wife, that Savitri, is the top authority and singular superior intellect in the entire story, to the point where even the god of death is basically deferential to Savitri's power and vision, even to the point where he bends the rules of his own job. He's the god of death. He has one job, to basically bring the living into the state of death. Right? And even his one job, he violates as a submission and honor and deference to her power and intellect and vision. Right? And so the natural rebuttal is, if you're reading the story telling me as an Indian woman I need to be deferential to my husband, what about the other parts of the story? A, I get to choose my own husband. And B, if even the god of death is going to defer to me, then why are you, uncle, giving me such a hard time? Right? And nobody says that because it's a patriarchal society. So that to me is an example, I mean, one of infinite examples in our world, right? Where a millenniums old myth with all the sacred wisdom packed into it from the glory of, the bounty of the legacy of Hindu culture, can be read in a profane way to serve an unjust, unfair, obviously lopsided patriarchy, right? Even though all the rest of the sacred juices is in there, and is unlocked when you look at it with a different lens, with a mythopoetic sacred lens, not a profane lens. So this is all in the same story, and yet it can be selectively used, just like the Frog King, in a profane, everyday way to impose fear, control, and threat. Wives, obey your husbands or else, instead of being read in the sacred mythopoetic way to bestow and bless with love, nurturing, and surrender, which then leads to insight and healing of men and women in the society.